Okay, hi everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining both in person, online, and at Silwood. This is another Changing Planet seminar, and it's me, Ariana, and Patrick running it today, together with Ben and Anna. We're also part of the team for the Changing Planet representatives. If you want to stay up with our latest events, you can join our mailing list to receive newsletters and follow us on social media. You will get the links in the chat soon. Before we start, there's just a little housekeeping that I'd like to do and that you need to be aware before I introduce the speaker. This session, as all the previous one, is going to be recorded. So please, if you're joining us online, ensure that your microphone is muted and it remains so during the entire duration of the talk. If you have any questions, you can put them in the chat and there will be an opportunity to ask them to the speaker at the end of the talk. If you want, please include your name and your affiliation so that we know where you're coming from and we can get a better idea of where your audience is joining us from. With that being said, my name is Ariana and I'll be chairing this seminar today. This is the last seminar on our team translating research into policy, informing outcomes and implementing actions, which brought you a series of seminars highlighting the role of science in the decision-making process. In this regard, it's my pleasure to welcome our speaker for today, Dr. Sian Henley, who is a lecturer in marine sciences at the University of Edinburgh. She also serves as a vice chair of the Southern Ocean Observing System, a member of the Southern Ocean Task Force for the United Nations Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development, and as a science team leader within the Scottish Alliance for Geoscience, Environment and Society. Sian has a diverse range of research interests, from polar ocean ecosystem change to climate change impacts on children worldwide. She's a passionate lecturer, educator, and communicator across the spectrum of marine and polar sciences. She will speak today about our Antarctic marine ecosystems under pressure. And so without further ado, over to you, Sian, and thank you and welcome.
Thank you very much. And what a pleasure it is to be here giving a research seminar in person. Wow, I think it's been a while that we've all been waiting for that. I understand the last seminar in this series was also in person. So let's hope that this is the beginning of a trend that will continue for a long time into the future. So thanks everyone for coming, both in the room and online, wherever in the world you are. And I'm really delighted to be here to speak to you today about Antarctic marine ecosystems. So the Antarctic feels like it's quite a long way away from a lot of us, but what I want to convince you over the course of this talk is that what's happening in Antarctica is actually critically important for the entire global human population. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my experience of the UN Climate Change Conference COP26 in Glasgow last year, where we presented this work to be the Southern Ocean voice in one of the main parts of the blue zone within the COP conference, and where our mission was to raise the profile of these ecosystems, why they need to be protected and how that needs to be done. So I should start by acknowledging the vast team of people that are behind this talk, one of whom I'm delighted is in the room. So we had scientists from across the world, from 19 different countries, and there were 200 of us in total. And of those 200 scientists, there were 7 of us that represented the team at COP26, 4 of us in person and 3 of us remote. So I'll come on to talking in a bit more detail about that. And the thing that I want you to take away from this seminar, if you take away nothing else, is that the protection that is required for Antarctic marine ecosystems needs to happen at the local scale and at the global scale. And these two things need to go hand in hand. And that's because there are global drivers of change in these systems that are beyond any local or regional management frameworks. They just cannot account for the global changes that are occurring. So global policy on climate change is critical to protect these ecosystems. At the same time, there is an important role for local and regional management measures to enhance the resilience of these systems to climate change and environmental change in order to make them better able to cope with the changes that are going to be exerted upon them. So the approach that we need to take needs to be a two-pronged approach of local action and global action. So let's see whether we can get the clicker to work. There we go. That was a nerve-wracking moment. I wonder, are you co-host? If you could just hide the ribbon at the top. That would
it's not visible online.
Okay.
It's just in the room, unless you
Okay. Let me
I
try.
can do it like you're talking.
There we go. Let's see how we get on. Okay, so just as an overview of what I'm going to talk about this afternoon, I'm going to give an introduction to the marine ecosystem assessment for the Southern Ocean and what we did at COP26. And then I'm going to go through the key message that we delivered on this global platform by talking about the importance of the Southern Ocean, the pressures, the threats, and the impacts on the ecosystems of the Southern Ocean, and the critical ecosystem services that this region provides. And I'm going to use that as a basis to describing why it's critically important to safeguard these ecosystems and ecosystem services against both global scale climate change and the more direct impacts of human activity happening within the Southern Ocean itself. And then I'll have a bit of a kind of honest look at where we are now and what we need to do next in terms of achieving our objectives of effectively safeguarding these systems now and into the future. There we go. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. I'll just keep clicking. Okay, so I am here today, and we were there at COP on behalf of this big international team that pulled together the marine ecosystem assessment for the Southern Ocean. So I'll just give a quick introduction to what this initiative was and what it sought to achieve. So it grew out of a program, the Southern Ocean Regional Program, of the International IMBER project. So as usual with science, lots of acronyms. IMBER is the International Integrated Marine Biosphere Research Program, which is a program of the Scientific Committee on Oceanic Research and the Future Earth Initiative. And its regional program is ICED, which is integrating climate and ecosystem dynamics in the Southern Ocean. So this was a program that has occurred over the course of the last decade, and the major objectives of this program were to quantify and characterize the ecosystem functioning, its interplay with biogeochemistry in the Southern Ocean, and the global connectivity of the Southern Ocean to the larger scale. And it also, for the first time really, for one of these major framework projects, had a really strong focus on modeling the processes within the Southern Ocean in the context of the whole Earth system. And then a core outcome that was targeted was to provide relevant and timely information to policymakers. So as a result of the ICE program, the major kind of headline messages were that these ecosystems are under intense pressure from lots of different drivers, lots of different angles over lots of different temporal and spatial scales. And in order to have any hope of addressing these challenges, policymakers really needed tailored information. They weren't going to go off and read all of our papers. They weren't going to go mining our data and looking and creating their own plots. So they really need tailored, very straightforward and easy to understand information. So this led to the vision of the marine ecosystem assessment for the Southern Ocean, which was to undertake periodic and systematic assessments of the status and change of Southern Ocean ecosystems. And this was with the objective of informing global and local policy decisions to safeguard these systems. So in a nutshell, what MISO did was to assess the status and change of the key species in the Southern Ocean, from the primary producers right up to the top predators, and the interactions between them that constitute the food web and ecosystem functioning, and the habitats that all of these organisms rely on, as well as the biogeochemical processes that underpin this ecosystem functioning. Okay, so with the most of the work of the MISO initiative done, we went to COP26 to share the key findings, the current status of the work, and the key priorities for what needed to come next. And this was the headline Southern Ocean contribution within the cryosphere pavilion, which was in the UNFCCC blue zone, so the formal UN bit of COP26. And they had a Polar Oceans Day on Saturday, the 6th of November, where we represented the Southern Ocean contribution or story that needed to be brought to this international policy forum. And so there were 7 of us, as I mentioned, so 4 of us in person who gave most of the talks, and then online participation from Hobart on the right-hand side here in Tasmania, and Valparaiso in Chile. So we really wanted to reflect the fact that this was a very international endeavor representing the whole community, and therefore we wanted attendance in by some means or other from this diverse international community. And really our core aim of attending COP26 was to advocate for urgent global reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, along with lots of other groups that were attending, but our specific focus was, of course, on the Southern Ocean. So we were aiming to instigate climate recovery so that these ecosystems could avoid irreversible deterioration. And to highlight the myriad societal benefits that are provided by this region, and therefore make policy makers and members of the public aware that what happens in Antarctica really doesn't stay in Antarctica and is important for the entire global community. So our key message was that only by mitigating global climate change alongside effective local conservation and management can we effectively safeguard these vulnerable polar oceans now and into the future. So I'll now just go through what we presented at COP and the messages that we were trying to put across. So the first thing to explain to any audience is why they should care. You know, why should we care about the Southern Ocean? If you live in the Southern Hemisphere, you might care about it a bit more, but for people who live in the Northern Hemisphere, it can be a difficult sell. So the first thing to point out is the vast size of the Southern Ocean, occupying the entire region at the southernmost portion of the global ocean system. And this region occupies a very important place in the global ocean circulation system. So we can see from this nice image here that the ocean currents bring water masses from throughout the one global ocean to the Southern Ocean, where it gets mixed, it gets integrated, and then it gets redistributed back out to the other major ocean basins. So this makes the Southern Ocean vast and very important mixer of ocean processes and properties over both short and long timescales. And if we look at the world from the point of view of the Southern Ocean, with the Southern Ocean in the middle here, we can really see that what's happening at the Southern Ocean really is at the heart of this global circulation system, and therefore is a critical regulator of the transport of heat around planet Earth and the transport of nutrients and carbon dioxide throughout the global ocean. And the Southern Ocean is also a very important region of exchange of carbon dioxide between the deep ocean and the atmosphere. And in this way, the Southern Ocean has a very important role to play in directly regulating climate change on short timescales relevant to human activity and human behaviors, and also much longer timescales up to the glacial interglacial cycles. And this is all because of the central position of the Southern Ocean within the global ocean circulation system and the exchange processes of carbon between the deep ocean and the atmosphere. Now, one of the most important or starkest forms of physical variation in the Southern Ocean, one of the most important physical features, is the seasonal cycle of sea ice. So got two plots here from last September and the February just passed to show the difference between the maximum sea ice extent of over 18 million square kilometers and the annual minimum sea ice extent of just over 2 million square kilometers. So we've got this huge physical variability occurring on an annual basis that influences everything else, both within the Southern Ocean and beyond. But as you might expect, this behavior of sea ice and its seasonal cycle is changing as a result of human-driven climate change that we're seeing in current times and over many decades now. So to look at this in slightly more detail, I've got some temporal trends here of the sea ice extent anomaly. So what this means is that for each of these years, we have a monthly average, either September or February, and what is plotted is the difference between the extent in that month compared to the average that was measured between 1981 and 2010. And what we can see is that the September sea ice extent has actually increased over the satellite period with a slightly significant trend. But since 2014, we've seen this precipitous drop-off of sea ice at the circumpolar scale, and then some fairly high amplitude variability since then. In February, we do not see a statistically significant trend overall, but again, we see this precipitous drop-off and then much larger variability at lower levels in the most recent years. So we can take all of this to infer that climate change is causing great changes in Antarctic sea ice. It's not causing a one-way dramatic and sustained decline in the same way that it is in the Arctic, but it is causing great variability. And over recent years, the sea ice extent has dropped off significantly, both at the end of winter, when you would expect it to be at its largest, and at the end of the summer, when you would expect it to be at its smallest over the seasonal cycle. So how does this affect ecosystems, or why is this important for ecosystems? Well, this is my favorite image from any of my papers. So I put it in all of my talks about the Southern Ocean and plenty of others as well. And what I hope it does is show that the entire ecosystem and all its components and processes are to some extent reliant on the sea ice that comes and goes on an annual basis. So we see the sea ice regulating the springtime phytoplankton bloom, which is the major contributor to primary production over an annual cycle, and the contribution of sea ice algae. So these are algae living within the ice pack itself. And these primary producers are the major food source for zooplankton like copepods and Antarctic krill. And these organisms then feed everything else in the food web, right up to the higher trophic levels and the top predators. So because the phytoplankton bloom and the sea ice algal bloom are very highly dependent on the springtime retreat of sea ice, that means that changes in the dynamics of that sea ice cycle have implications for the primary producers and therefore the entire ecosystem, because these primary producers feed everything else in the Southern Ocean. So what MESO was really able to do was to characterize and quantify some of these dependencies to a greater extent than had been achieved in previous work. So we were able to really elucidate the productivity of the ecosystems and the individual components of the ecosystem, but possibly more importantly, to make the links between things changing at the organismal scale of individual organisms and the larger scale processes that are driven by and in turn drive global climate change. And we also were able to assess the connectivity of Southern Ocean processes to global scale processes via the ocean currents that I showed previously, but also because a large number of organisms that live in the Southern Ocean for some of the year actually migrate in and out of the Southern Ocean on an annual basis. So this means that changes happening in the Southern Ocean or the effects of those changes are transported outside of the Southern Ocean, and similarly, changes happening elsewhere are transported into the Southern Ocean with these migrating organisms. And what we were really able to assess by the very nature of the scale of MESO and the number of people and different science teams that it engaged was to really shine a light on how much this ecosystem functioning in the Southern Ocean underpins biodiversity at the global scale, and therefore food security for millions of people all across the world. And this is primarily because the Southern Ocean regulates the amount of nutrients that are exported to the lower latitudes, because it has that mixing effect in the global ocean circulation system. So this regulates nutrient supply to the tropics and the equatorial regions, and therefore controls primary production and the productivity of the whole ecosystem throughout the global ocean system. And in terms of its role in taking up and storing carbon, these ecosystems also play an active role in regulating the climate at the global scale. And only because we came together as this huge international team with this focus on assessing the status and trends in marine ecosystems could we really make much firmer statements about this importance than has been possible in the past. So coming from the ecosystem for its own value and its intrinsic value for the organisms that live there and the processes that occur there, we can also think about what the Southern Ocean ecosystems offer to humanity, because like it or not, the only way we can get effective decision-making achieved is to make whatever we're talking about relevant to people and often financial objectives. So we've started much more recently to talk about the ecosystem services that the Southern Ocean provides, both within the Southern Ocean itself and also at the global scale. So there are three major types of ecosystem services from the Southern Ocean: provisioning ecosystem services like the fisheries for Antarctic krill and the Patagonian toothfish. And these play a role in underpinning global food security. So obvious direct implications for the human race. The regulating ecosystem services are a little bit less tangible, a little bit more difficult to get your head around, but surround the circulation of heat, nutrients, and carbon dioxide throughout the global oceans. And this is really about the very functioning of planet Earth. So it's slightly more difficult to understand in how this one thing affects this one group of people, but in terms of the functioning of the Earth system in which we all live, the Southern Ocean plays a disproportionately important role. The Southern Ocean is also a very important region for biological carbon capture. So this is where the carbon is taken up by primary production and then stored in organisms for tens to several hundreds of years, and therefore plays a role in supporting the blue carbon ecosystem service, which we're eventually recognizing is an important contribution to nature-based solutions to climate change. And then one that some people will absolutely think is important and others less so are the cultural ecosystem services. And I think we're recognizing more and more the importance of this. So considering the biodiversity and particularly the charismatic megafauna that you'd find in the Antarctic and the Southern Ocean as a cultural ecosystem service that has its own value, as well as a value for societal benefit and culture at the global scale, and also thinking of it as a global inheritance that future generations have an equal right to enjoy as the current and past generations have done. And what we were really able to say with more kind of strength than we'd ever been able to before is that the ecosystem services from the Southern Ocean are really critical to global society. And it's really the first time we've been able to say that with such conviction and such evidence behind it. But it's not all about scientific evidence. We are recognizing an increasingly important need to blend the natural sciences and the social sciences with the creative arts. So one of the things we did through the MISO initiative was to work with a local artist, and I mean local to the Southern Ocean, so based in Hobart, to really communicate some of the key messages that we were trying to convey in a way that is much more accessible to people who are not natural scientists. And I think this is very much the kind of direction of travel in how to communicate science effectively, both to policymakers directly, but also to the general public, who can then influence those in positions of power and influence to make the decisions that are required. So there are a number of cartoons that came from this initiative, all with the overarching message that the Southern Ocean needs climate change mitigation, and it needs it now in order to continue to deliver the ecosystem processes that everybody needs. Okay, so thinking about the drivers of change and the stressors on these ecosystems. So another major objective of MISO was to synthesize the available evidence on all the stressors on the Southern Ocean ecosystems. And these consisted of the local or the regional stressors of human activity within the Southern Ocean, and the global stressors, which are largely related to large-scale climate and environmental change. So what we've got here is the large-scale drivers associated with global climate change and the local drivers resulting from human activity. And the most important thing about these stressors and these drivers is that we're not thinking about individual stressors working in isolation. We have to consider this a multiple stressor system where different stressors are working together or sometimes against each other, but normally the interactions between stressors make particular stressors worse, or the level of threat to the ecosystem worse than the individual stressors would. So we need to think about the interactions between these stressors and also the different responses of different organisms to the same stressor, potentially over different temporal and spatial scales. So when we're going through the rest of the talk, just do keep this in mind, that we are working with a multiple stressor system with a combination of the large scale environmental and climate related drivers and the local drivers related to human activity. And what is really important to recognize, and I'm going to go through a couple of examples to illustrate this, is that large scale changes are already underway. I think it's quite common for people to think of the polar regions as pristine or untouched by human activity. Well, the bad news is that is just not true. They are arguably some of the most pristine environments on Earth, but they are already impacted by human activity, and significant changes in the different parts of the system, and therefore the functioning of the entire system, are already underway. So here's some work from Angus Atkinson at Plymouth Marine Lab, and a large group of co-authors looked at changes in the distribution of Antarctic krill over several decades. So the reason that this is important, as I said earlier, is that Antarctic krill is the primary food source for a large number of organisms within the Southern Ocean, and therefore changes of the food source will directly impact large numbers of organisms that live in the Southern Ocean. So what we're seeing here is the distribution of krill density, and it's shown here in by latitude. And what we can see is that in the late 1920s and the 1930s, the krill populations were really concentrated around South Georgia in the Scotia Arc. And the mean latitude of the entire krill population was at 57.3. If we jump forward to the late 1970s to the first half of the 1990s, we can see that the krill population has really spread out and is now occurring to a much greater extent than before down the Antarctic Peninsula, as well as still being in large numbers around South Georgia. And this mean latitude hasn't really changed very much, but we are still seeing the majority of krill above or north of the 57.5 degree line of latitude. And when we move forward to the most recent time period, so 1996 to 2016, we see that the density around South Georgia has diminished significantly, and the density along the Antarctic Peninsula has increased. Now, what this is showing is that over this time period of 90 years, the maximum density in which krill occurs in any one line of latitude has declined significantly from numbers up and around 200 to around 30. So we've seen a reduction in the maximum krill density, and we've also seen a southward contraction of these of this distribution, and that is driven by changes in temperature primarily, and changes in sea ice distribution and sea ice dynamics along the Antarctic Peninsula. Moving up the food chain now to penguins, what I'm showing here is an analysis of the number of penguin breeding pairs at Palmer Station, which is in the central region of the West Antarctic Peninsula, where those sea ice declines have occurred to a significant extent over the satellite record. What we can immediately see is that the total numbers in black have declined substantially over that time period. So these are the adelies here, for those of you not familiar with your different penguin species. And we can see that most of this total decline is because of a significant drop-off in the numbers of Adelie penguins. And this is because this species is ice dependent, so needs sea ice as part of its life cycle. And it's also it's very reliant on krill as a food source. So as the krill distributions have changed, the penguin populations have also changed. You will see that in green, we have numbers of the Gen 2 penguins actually increasing over this time. And that's because this is historically a sub-Antarctic species, which is used to warmer temperatures. So as the environment at the Antarctic Peninsula becomes more maritime, warmer and wetter, it's actually more suitable for this species of penguins. And then the chinstrap penguins show a slight increase, but much smaller than the Gen 2s. But what we can see overall is that the number of penguin breeding pairs, which maps almost directly onto the breeding success of penguins and therefore the sustainability of the population, has declined significantly over the 1970s, 80s, and up to the present day. Now, taking a slightly more positive news story, because we don't want it all to be doom and gloom, we also did an analysis of the benthic ecosystems. So these are organisms that live either on or in or close to the seafloor. And as marine terminating glaciers have retreated over recent decades, what they've actually done in quite a few cases is to reveal islands that weren't there before because they were underneath the glacier. And as these islands emerge, as the glaciers retreat back past them, we see that these islands can become incredibly highly productive hotspots of biological activity, as happened here at Potter Cove, which is in the northern part of the Antarctic Peninsula. So this is potentially a negative feedback to climate change because all of a sudden we've got a new environment where carbon can be captured and stored over climate relevant timescales. In benthic ecosystems that have been uncovered for a lot longer, we are also seeing changes in carbon storage related to changes in the physical environment. So this shows that the duration of thick and permanent sea ice cover has declined. So it's fast ice. That just means it's attached to the coastline nearby. So we can just take this as sea ice duration. And we've seen that as that has declined, the frequency of ice scour has increased. And ice scour is caused by icebergs, which when the sea ice is no longer there for a longer part of the year, these icebergs can move around more and therefore cause more damage to the seafloor that they scratch up against and kind of ground on the seabed, destroying everything in their path. And we can see the direct effects of this in the increased mortality of an important benthic species over the same time period that the frequency of ice scour has increased. So this is a bad effect, a negative effect of climate change, where we're seeing decreasing sea ice, increasing iceberg scour, and increasing mortality or death in benthic species, and therefore less carbon storage. However, these same authors a few years later provided this updated analysis where they also took into account the duration of the phytoplankton growing season. And it's the duration that is most important because these benthic organisms are very slow. They don't require much food. They maybe have a meal once every couple of weeks. So what is important in regulating their food supply is the total time in each year that that food supply is available, rather than the amount of food available at any given time. So what these authors found is that as the sea ice cover has reduced. Actually, we're seeing longer periods over which phytoplankton are growing and supplying that food source to the benthic ecosystems. And therefore, in years where the phytoplankton bloom is longer, we actually get more carbon storage. And they summarize this really nicely by showing the effects on blue carbon immobilized or stored. And they showed that the negative effect of ice scour is pretty important, because when these icebergs collide with the seabed, they basically remove everything in their path. But actually the duration of the phytoplankton growing season is more important, because it applies over a much larger area, and it's the food supply that comes from this that is the most important control on how much blue carbon is stored in these Antarctic ecosystems. So overall, the picture is that as climate change continues and proceeds around Antarctica, we're actually seeing an increase in blue carbon storage with the small amount of study that has been done. So there's a lot more research to be done here. So coming back to the whole ecosystem perspective, we then see that each of these components that I've just highlighted, so the krill, the penguins, and the benthic ecosystems, when each of these components of the system is changing, they play a very important role in the system as a whole, and that means the whole system is changing. And what we were able to show as part of the marine ecosystem assessment was that these shifts that are occurring and the loss of key components and functions has really severe consequences at the global scale as well as regionally. And we're able to take that one step further to linking to the effects on ecosystem services of biodiversity, food security, nutrient supply, and climate regulation. So to go into the ecosystem services in a bit more detail, when we're thinking about creating policy around these ecosystem services, we need to think about the interface between global policy and Antarctic policy. And what this shows is that as we follow the pathway of risk from climate through environment all the way to people, there is a certain kind of territory that global policy can take care of in the climate and the environment. And then when we get to more local matters, it's really the Antarctic policy that has to take over. And really, these two things have to go hand in hand. And as you can see from the current status bar at the bottom, there's a lot of work still to be done, both in the empirical scientific underpinning, but also in at the interface between the natural and social sciences to understand better how these changes in the climate and environment eventually affect people through ecosystem services. And we're thinking more and more about the risk to ecosystem services. This is partly genuine science and partly using terminology that non-scientists understand, so framing things in terms of risk. And what we did in this particular paper as part of MISO was to assess the risk of a negative outcome associated with climate change for each of these key ecosystem services. And we can see that the highest risk of a negative outcome by far is on Antarctic krill, because this is susceptible to changes in each of the major drivers that are currently affecting Southern Ocean systems, so temperature, ocean acidification, and ice loss. And then, as I just described, actually the blue carbon pathway is at a low risk of a negative outcome, and actually the potential of a positive outcome and small role in offsetting the increase in atmospheric carbon dioxide. So by coming up with these risk registers, we are better able to convert what we know scientifically into tangible actions for policymakers at local and global scales. And just to go into this in a tiny bit more detail, this is a table of the fish species in the Southern Ocean. And what it really does is highlights the major factors that we need to consider across the whole ecosystem. And this, as I touched on earlier, is the fact that different species of fish respond differently to the drivers underway. And therefore, we're seeing substantial response variability. This is both in the type of the response and the scales in time and space that these responses occur over. And that's why in some cases we have perhaps positive impacts, negative and mixed. And what this also highlights is really the importance of these compounding impacts, in this case of climate change, pollution, sea ice loss and fisheries. What we synthesize from all of this is that the risk of climate change and human activity on these systems is really two-pronged. And that is that as climate change and human stressors increase, which they're very likely to do, this increases the risk to ecosystem services. At the same time, the activity of human beings within the Southern Ocean is only going to intensify. It's still at a fairly low level. That is only going to become more intense. And this increases the demand for ecosystem services. So we've now got greater demand for something that is at greater risk. And therefore, the threat that comes from this risk is amplified by climate change and the direct impacts of human activity. Okay, so I mentioned earlier that one of the things that MISO was able to do was to really hammer home the global importance of Southern Ocean processes. And this image goes through it in great detail. I won't go through that in the interest of time, but I think suffice to say, one of the major achievements of MISO was not only to describe the large number of these linkages and interactions, but also the extent of them and the complexity of these linkages, right from climate and environmental change through organismal responses to ecosystem services to human impacts, to impacts on global society, right through to policy making. And the fact that every single one of these pillars or steps along the pathway has global connectivity, which means it's influenced by global processes and things happening elsewhere, and has a significant impact on those global processes and things happening elsewhere. And we're really able to hammer home the message that what's happening in the Southern Ocean affects the entire global system and the entire human population. So what of the future? Where are we sitting now? This slide shows some images from the Access Earth System model, the version that was used in the CMIP6 ensemble. And what it does is simulate seawater temperatures from 1900 going forward. And the reason that we do this is because MISO has taught us that rising temperatures are the greatest threat to Antarctic marine ecosystems. Ocean acidification is also very important, but this is an indirect effect of the cause of the rising temperatures in the first place. So this analysis, we really do focus on the temperatures. And this is a simplified version, but illustrative of what we're looking at different levels of policy intervention related to the goals of the Paris Agreement, which is to keep warming within 2 degrees and hopefully 1.5 degrees. So we've extracted from this model what seawater temperatures around Antarctica will look like with a 1.5 degree global warming level, 2 degrees and 4 degrees. And we've divided them somewhat kind of clunkily into dark blue, light blue, red and black. The dark blue color is where sea ice cover is over 25%, so it's essentially sea ice covered. The light blue shows areas that have seawater temperatures that are optimal for polar species. The red coloring indicates temperatures that cause heat stress to the vast majority of polar species, and the black color indicates where temperatures are too hot for polar species. So what we see is that large parts of the Southern Ocean, north of 55 or 60 degrees south, have always been too warm for these polar species, but the coverage of this black area has contracted towards the continent, and therefore there is more and more area of the Southern Ocean that is uninhabitable to these polar species. So at or up to 1.5 degrees, we see that the ecosystems and the services that they provide are largely maintained and preserved with little impact. Once we get over 1.5 degrees, as aimed for in the Paris Agreement, we see that surface water temperatures become more erratic, particularly in the spring and summer, and that summer temperatures get to the point of being stressful to a large number of marine species. And this means that the ecosystem services are starting to become degraded over 1.5 degrees. We are losing elements of the system, and we are seeing much more significant losses of sea ice, which have cascading impacts throughout the entire ecosystem because of the degree to which these organisms have their life cycles linked to the seasonal cycle of sea ice. And in particular, when we get over 1.5 degrees, we see that the geographic range over which a large number of ice-dependent species can live is contracted on the Antarctic continent. Once we hit 2 degrees, we see that the scale, the geographic scope of the entire polar system, so where we've got dark blues and light blues, is much, much smaller. And even to the point where we're seeing sea ice loss and warming in the Ross and Weddell seas, which are the most southerly ocean systems on the planet, and therefore should be the last to warm and lose their sea ice. And then once we get up and over 2 degrees C, so once we've lost the Paris Agreement, we see severe and widespread warming and ice losses, fundamental changes in ecosystem structure, and very high risks to a large number of species. And it becomes very doubtful that recovery, if we do at some point start to mitigate global climate change, it seems unlikely that once we've gone over 2 degrees C, these systems will not be able to recover, even if we come below that level of warming in the future. So therefore, the effects will be sustained over much longer periods of time. So all of this means that from the perspective of Southern Ocean ecosystems, very much in line with what we know at the global scale with relevance to the human population, is that we need the global warming level to remain below 2 degrees C definitely, and ideally below 1.5 degrees C. So convenient, you might think, that our message is entirely aligned with the Paris Agreement, but this is because of a large, huge, massive body of scientific evidence on which the Paris Agreement was originally based. So again, we come to our artist friends to communicate these key messages about the happy and healthy and well-functioning ecosystem if warming is limited to 1.5 degrees, and the stressful situation and degradation of ecosystems and services if we go beyond those limits. So what we were able to say here is that there are a large number of changes occurring in Southern Ocean ecosystems that are beyond the scope of regional management frameworks, and therefore we need global policy on climate change mitigation to limit further change and therefore ensure the sustainability of Southern Ocean ecosystems and services. But there is a role for local and regional management measures to enhance the resilience of these systems to the climate and environmental changes that are inevitable. We can also preserve these ecosystems and provide refuges, for example, by safeguarding the ecosystems in the Ross and Weddell Seas. And we can aid recovery of parts of the ecosystems that have been previously damaged by climate and environmental change. And marine protected areas play a particularly important role here, which I'll come on to. And these local and regional conservation and management methods need to be precautionary. They need to be very conservative with a small c, and careful in the context of what we know. And they need to be responsive both to ongoing changes in the system and also to new scientific evidence as it becomes available. And this means that all of these policy interventions that we're working towards need to be underpinned by ongoing research and monitoring, which keeps the scientific communicators and the policymakers themselves as up to date as they can possibly be. And even once these management measures are in place, they need to be adaptable to further changes that happen and new information that is obtained. And probably most importantly of all that we've learned at the global scale is that equitable, inclusive, and well-coordinated approaches incorporating the full range of stakeholders are the most important or possibly the only way of effectively actioning the required policy to safeguard these systems. That's not only true of the Southern Ocean, that's true everywhere. So really getting everybody around the table and coming up with solutions that if not everybody likes, that everybody can get on board with and can support and can agree on in order to make real progress. So where are we? I'm aware of the time, but I'm on my last couple of slides. So I just wanted to give a quick update on current progress. So I'm not going to give to say too much about the Glasgow Climate Pact. That's an entire seminar or several of itself. So I'm just summarizing the headline messages here that are relevant to Southern Ocean ecosystems. So in making the 2020s a decade of climate action and support, the Glasgow Climate Pact aimed to strengthen efforts to build resilience to climate change and to close the gap between what nations have currently signed up to and what's actually required to bring global emissions to a level that will keep us to only 1.5 degrees of warming. And to provide the finance and the funding to achieve both of these things by fulfilling the pledge, the commitment to provide $100 billion a year from the developed countries to the developing countries to support climate change mitigation and adaptation. And the other thing that was much talked about during COP and afterwards was that the Paris rulebook was finalized with respect to market mechanisms and non-market approaches. And there was a major advance on the transparency of the reporting around this. But this is all very human focused. So actually in the context of Southern Ocean ecosystems, the only thing that matters is whether we can manage to curb our greenhouse gas emissions, because there is very little capacity to adapt in these systems, and therefore the only way to protect them from climate change is to mitigate that climate change. At the local scale, there is some marine protection and conservation around Antarctica, so it is widely recognized that marine protected areas can maintain resilience, allow for recovery, and provide refuges within the Southern Ocean. So this has led to the establishment of the world's first high seas marine protected area beyond national jurisdiction, which is the South Orkney Islands Southern Shelf MPA. So that was established in 2009. And the Ross Sea region MPA, which was agreed in 2016 and came into force in 2017. And there are three proposals that are currently under consideration, but have been for a good few years now. Since 2018 was the first time they were debated on the International Commission. So these are at the Antarctic Peninsula, around East Antarctica, and in the Weddell Sea. But there are definite challenges to overcome and barriers to the establishment and agreement of these marine protected areas, largely around the sufficiency of data to prove that we need marine protected areas, and the balance between marine conservation and the rational use of marine resources. So in both global climate change mitigation and local and regional management that are both required to effectively safeguard these ecosystems, it's fair to say we've made some progress, but there's still a really long way to go. So this is my final slide. Hopefully, I've talked for too long, as I normally do, apologies. Hopefully I've managed to convince you that Southern Ocean ecosystems are globally important for many different reasons, among them biodiversity, nutrient cycling and distribution, and the uptake of carbon and its role in regulating climate, that the ecosystem services from the Southern Ocean are critically important for the entire global human population. And therefore, we all need to care about what happens to these systems. We are all citizens of the Southern Ocean in a way, and we all need to be stewards to safeguard its welfare and its sustainability going forward. So in order to mitigate the pressures on Southern Ocean ecosystems and services, we need urgent action on climate change mitigation at the global scale and local conservation and management within the Southern Ocean itself. So I think it's fair to say that the marine ecosystem assessment for the Southern Ocean, building on a large body of other work by the international Southern Ocean community, has shown pretty emphatically that there's a need for joined up, well-coordinated and comprehensive conservation and policy to protect these ecosystems. We know what we need to do. Now the question is, when and how well will we do it? So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much for attending in person and online, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Sian, for an amazing talk. It was brilliant. Might be biased by my love for the ocean. It was lovely to see quite a few familiar names on your slides. As usual, if anyone has questions here and in Stillwood, Patrick and I will be coordinating and will be rotating between here, Stillwood, and online. I'd like to start here if anyone has any questions. Whoa. Okay, I'll start from the very back.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. Perhaps I was interested in something you mentioned at the beginning, because with the initiative, you also came up, if I understood this correctly, with some proposal for policymakers to implement. Could you give a couple of examples of what that entailed, especially for, I guess, the Northern Hemisphere, which is something, yeah, we usually disregard a lot. And I'm thinking also in terms of both mitigation and adaptation solutions, because in certain aspects, it also looked like they overlapped and, well, we need both, but if there was a priority for one or the other.
Yeah, sure. So I'll actually answer your second question first, because I think that'll be more kind of joined up way of doing it. So in terms of adaptation, these organisms have very little capacity to adapt to change because they are very well adapted to their environment as it is. It's extreme, it's cold, it's dominated by ice, it's difficult for a lot of organisms to live. And that means that the organisms that do live there are incredibly well adapted to that environment. And they have been Antarctica has been in that position for about 25 million years. So that's how long these systems have been evolving and developing to maximize the use of their environment. So in terms of adaptation to climate change, there's little that can be done. We can build resilience, which is where the marine protected areas and other conservation measures come in. But really the only effective way that we can protect these ecosystems against climate change is mitigation, not adaptation. And then on your second question about the specific advice to policy, that's a really nice question, and I'm glad you asked it, because we often don't get to that point. We often talk about our science and then say, oh, it's really important, somebody should make some decisions about it. But we kind of shy away from actually saying what needs to happen. So a good example, we are currently finalizing the summary for policymakers, which will be a document in of itself. And then there will be a contribution to Nature, which summarizes the summary for policymakers in order to get it out to as big an audience as possible. So in terms of the logistics, that work is still ongoing and is due in the next couple of months. So do keep your eyes open for that. But what is actually much more effective is going to policy fora and saying the key messages directly. In my experience, policymakers definitely don't read a scientific paper. They might skim a summary for policymakers, they might not. So actually by going to workshops where scientists and policymakers are brought together, or other discussion fora, is a much more effective way of communicating those messages. So one I was involved in recently was with the European Commission, and we gave very specific advice on the fisheries catches, which European countries are involved in Southern Ocean fisheries, and therefore what those catch limits had to be in order to be precautionary and sustainable in the long term. And probably most importantly of all, that they should not increase until there is fully adequate scientific information to say that an increase in harvesting can still be sustainable. And that is a long way off. I might even say it's unlikely to happen. So really the recommendation was that these catch limits need to be really low, because there's a lot we don't know. We don't really take into account future changes in fisheries management at present. So climate change doesn't really come into it. So the recommendation was that the catch limits need to stay low. They need to not be increased. And over time, we need to start to incorporate climate change considerations in future forecasting of fisheries quotas. And then another key outcome of that particular policy briefing was about the emissions in European countries. So really meaningful commitments to keeping 1.5 within reach, which up until COP26, I think it's fair to say we're lacking from the vast majority of countries. There has been some progress since then. I think there's still a big gap to be closed. But one thing that has been emphasized since COP26 and leading into COP27 in Egypt later this year is that COP26 was never intended to solve all the problems and then we're done. You know, it's part of a process. So what we need to do is keep building on that momentum. The UK needs to continue to use its presidency, which it has until the conference in Egypt, to keep pushing the agenda, both internally and externally. And as COP27 and COP28 and other COPs in turn come around, we need to keep making progress in the same direction that we are currently, but we need to be doing it much faster and at a much greater scale. Okay.
Hi, I think I've got the mic as well. Hi, Shah, thank you. That was a fantastic talk. I was also wondering, I mean, you actually answered a lot of my questions kind of in that, but have you been able to send a lot of this to CAMLA yet, the Antarctic policy? Because I know the work's been out since they've met. or do you think this nature paper is going to kind of do that? And also, do you think MPAs are the way forward? Because all these CAMLAR meetings every year, the Antarctic policymakers is very like, oh my gosh, we didn't designate another MPA. But actually, what you were just saying about fishing quotas, and particularly like seasonally and at certain times of the year, when fish production and krill production is really important for the ecosystem, it could, like, that could be more effective and get agreement better. So do you see some trade-offs there?
Yeah, so thanks. And if anybody was wondering who the other MISO author in the room was, it was Emma. So yeah, great to work with you on this project. So yeah, about CAMLAR. So for those of you that don't know, fisheries in the Southern Ocean are overseen by the Commission for the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources, which is referred to as CAMLAR, to be less of a mouthful. So this is an international commission with over 50 parties that all come together to agree on fisheries management in the Southern Ocean. And it operates by consensus. So this means that everybody there has to agree before anything happens. And that's what Emma's picking up on by saying we go to CAMLAR and things don't get agreed because one or two countries stand in the way and therefore no progress is made. So in terms of whether MISO has actually influenced CAMLAR, I definitely think it has. I think our biggest challenge has been that these meetings haven't been in person. And I think that has been a major obstacle because it's all too easy. We probably know in the room that it's much easier to ignore a meeting on Zoom than it is when you're sitting in a room looking at people in the eye. So I think CAMLAR has suffered from that. I think the Antarctic Treaty consultative meetings have also suffered from that. So I think the situation within the marine protected areas and the decision making around those, I feel like we're chipping away at it and working in the right direction. And the work that was done within MISO has underpinned that to a large extent. But I think a lot of the policymakers are still saying, okay, so that's all great. What's the key message? And that's where the summary for policymakers will really come into its own. So there's the summary for policymakers that will be out by the time the next CAMLAR happens and the next Antarctic Treaty consultative meetings. And there is also an editorial as part of the IPCC process, which really highlights the plight of Southern Ocean ecosystems within that international climate change space. So I think those are the big kind of steps forward that we're now waiting for to build on the progress that's already been achieved. And then in terms of whether MPAs are the answer, I would say they're not the answer. I would say they are part of the answer in any kind of ocean conservation. I think we need to consider the big, large scale, intergovernmental things that we can draw on a map. But we also need to consider individual action. And with particular relevance to the Southern Ocean, I think the tourist industry has a role to play as one of the major private company stakeholders in the Southern Ocean. Actually, the environmental credentials of the tourist operating ships are pretty good. You know, their environmental protocols and their behaviours and the messages that they give to their tourists are all in line with what we're trying to achieve as a scientific community. And I think the more voices there are influencing the decision making, the better. So I think MPAs are part of the answer, and we certainly need accelerated progress on those 3 MPAs that I highlighted, but also individual action and much smaller scale conservation measures like the specially protected areas, specially managed areas, which tend to be land systems, but they're on the coast, so they affect the ocean, and they are much easier to bring in the first place and much easier to manage once they're in. And whilst they don't occur at such scale, they have an important role to play.
Thank you. Sophie, did you have a question? Okay. Anyone with any other questions? Oh, I should probably talk like that. Yeah.
Thank you. Sorry for making you walk all the way over. With respect to the MPAs in Southern Oceans, there's a certain degree of, I know kind of globally, of problems to some degree with enforcement of MPAs and with the degree of what is actually protected in MPAs being potentially insufficient to actually provide the benefits that it hopes to. Given that these are not in national waters, if they're in the Southern Ocean, what's the kind of, is there a sufficient protocol for enforcement and that kind of issue, or are there issues there?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the South Orkney and Southern Shelf MPA was established in 2009, but is widely recognised to be in need of a strong update to its regulations and its procedures. So a lot of the activities that damage marine systems can still happen via one loophole or another. The Ross Sea MPA was much better in that regard, in that it's 72% no take, which is amongst the highest proportions of high seas MPAs in the world, and any MPA, in fact. So on paper, it's better and it's more effective. In terms of surveillance and checking for compliance, it's a vast ocean region. So I think the assessment at the moment seems to be that compliance is pretty good, but the major reason for that is because the Ross Seas are a really long way away, and it's difficult to get to, and it's expensive to get to, and therefore the human pressures on the system in the first place are not that great. We could be looking at a situation where climate change makes the Ross Sea more accessible because its conditions are favourable, it's easier to get there, shipping technology increases, and therefore when we see more pressures on the system, it might become more obvious what the gaps in compliance and enforcement are. And I think that is a challenge that CAMLA will have to address, and it will have to do that hand in hand with actually establishing and bringing in the new marine protected areas. The only kind of counterpoint I would say to that is that the nations who have signed up to the Antarctic Treaty and the CAMLA Commission have done so voluntarily, and the way that the governance actually works is it's not the Antarctic Treaty System or CAMLA that enforces the rules. It's the Antarctic Treaty System and CAMLA that recommend the rules that national entities then establish as regulations, rules, protocols, procedures, and national operators from wherever they're operating from are accountable to their own national legislation. So because of that framework, I think compliance probably is much higher than it would be if it was one of these intergovernmental institutions that was in control in a more kind of overarching way. And at the very kind of pragmatic level, that basically means that the paperwork and the bureaucracy has to be done by the individual operators, sent to their national entities, approved by their national entities. And then the reporting is quite robust about where they've been and what they've done, certainly in the cases of fisheries and tourism and scientific research operations, which are the three most important human or the most prevalent human uses in the Southern Ocean. So the reporting of each of those vessel types or activity types is really quite rigorous and would be picked up at the national level if there was anything awry. So that's not to say it's flawless. I'm sure there are issues with compliance to some extent, but I think to a lesser extent, because the actual nitty-gritty of the legislation is done at the national level, which gives it more accountability than if it was this nebulous intergovernmental space.
Anyone? Any other questions? I have a small curiosity. How is historical krill density as calculated or estimated? How do we know how much krill there was in the 1920s?
So it's a really good question, actually, and it's kind of a small question that's part of a bigger question about how do we know what's happened in the past. And with specific relevance to the krill densities, that is done by catch of the original krill trawlers in the Southern Ocean, which were very small and not technologically adept as they are now. So that's one place that the data come from. The landings of krill trawling back in decades gone past. And also there's a lot that can be learned from the whaling expeditions. So the whales follow the krill aggregations. So by knowing something about how many whales there were in a particular place, which you know because of how many whales you caught, you can infer what the krill density might have been. So we're combining empirical data with inferences based on anecdotal evidence from stakeholders that were there over centuries gone by. So it's quite a kind of difficult thing to talk about as a conservationist and a ecologist or biological scientist, in that kind of acknowledging some of the benefits of the fact that whaling happened in the Southern Ocean to the extent that it almost wiped out the great whales. But one of the small benefits of it was that we do have data on krill, as I showed, whale distributions themselves, and also sea ice coverage in terms of how far south the ships could get in their whaling expeditions. So there is, the further in time you go, the further back in time you go over human relevant timescales without using geochemical proxies and all of that side of science, you get more and more reliant on anecdotal evidence, I think it's fair to say. So your uncertainty increases, but uncertainty is something that we deal with as scientists, and understanding how to communicate that is almost as important as knowing how to communicate the findings themselves. So I think acknowledging which data sources you've used and what the uncertainties are is a really important part of the overall message.
Well, fantastic. That's not what I expected at all. I thought that you were looking at sediments or something. That's amazing. I mean, sad, but amazing.
Yeah, and of course, I mean, I'm not paleoceanographer, but as you get much further back in time, things like isotopes and other geochemical proxies come in. But over the decadal timescales that we're talking about here, that's just not really an option. So it's more about using anecdotal evidence from logbooks of whalers and early exploration vessels from the golden age of Antarctic exploration.
Fantastic. Does anyone have any last minute questions here? Yes.
So I just wanted to ask maybe if you could develop further on the potential of the carbon capture of the retreat of the ices and what you were explaining before. So it's more of a general, really last minute.
Yep, absolutely. So I could give a whole seminar on that. I'll try not to do that because I am slightly aware of the time. But essentially, carbon is taken up by primary producers, and then it's passed on to things that eat those primary producers, or things that eat those things that eat the primary producers. And in that way, carbon is stored in different organisms over different periods of time, depending on the lifetime of those organisms. So a blue whale, for instance, weighs about 100 tons, lives for about 100 years. That's quite a lot of carbon stored for quite a long time. But actually, when you look at the seafloor ecosystems, the benthic ecosystems, we see organisms that can live just as long as that. They're not as big as a blue whale, but they do live for a long time. And they often have hard parts in their bodies, so either shells or skeletons, that are made of calcium carbonate, which is also a big carbon store, as well as the organic carbon that makes up their fat and their muscles and their flesh. And because they're already close to the seafloor, they have a much better chance of being buried. And once they're buried in the seafloor, they can sequester carbon for much longer periods of time. And because they've got these hard parts that are also made of carbon, that again enhances the likelihood of carbon that has come to them in their food ultimately being buried in the seabed. So the reason that that is increasing in certain places around coastal Antarctica, and I should re-emphasize that these studies have only been done in a few places, so we don't know that this is true throughout the Antarctic continental shelves, but in the studies that have been done, we've seen that the sea ice is retreating, and therefore the length of the growing season for phytoplankton is longer, and therefore there's a longer period of time over which food is sinking to the benthic ecosystems, which is better for them, enables them to take up more carbon, live for longer, and ultimately be buried in the sediments. And the reason that it's the duration of the phytoplankton bloom rather than the size of it, how much phytoplankton there is at any one time, is because these organisms grow very slowly. They're not very hungry. They don't have to eat very often. They maybe have to eat once every couple of weeks. So what is key to them is the total amount of time that food is available for, rather than the amount of food available at any one time. Because essentially, if there's a little bit of food, they've got enough. If there's loads of food, all of the extra goes to waste. So it's the competition between the icebergs coming along to a greater extent and smashing up the seafloor and therefore decimating the carbon stores. But at the larger scale, those carbon stores are bigger because there's food available over a longer period of time, and therefore more carbon is being captured.
Perfect. So thank you, Sian, again. It was amazing. Really brilliant talk. Thank you, everyone in the audience, for your questions, for being so engaged. I hope you enjoyed it. I definitely did. I'm sure everyone here did. Before we end, so the session is recorded like all the other ones, so it will be uploaded on YouTube in the next couple of days. This was the last seminar within the COP26 theme. We're now moving